Hey everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be covering the discography of the English band Curve. Curve is a very interesting band because they were one of many groups to come out of the emerging music scene that was happening in England in the late 80s and early 90s, and a lot of these bands were part of that shoegaze movement, and Curve is often given the shoegaze label because of some of their stylistic and production choices, and also because of their albums utilizing important shoegaze figures like Kevin Shields and Alan Moulder, and I know their vocalist, Tony Halliday, didn't like that label and felt like it put them too much into a box, and I do understand why she feels that way because while there are shoegaze elements to the Curve sound, one of their unique features that really separates them and gives them their own distinct voice is their wide use of electronics and sampling, and it's something that wasn't as commonly utilized with a lot of the other bands that Curve was grouped in with, and it was a style that I think allowed their sound to still stay fresh and evolve in an effective manner as they continued throughout their discography over the years. They have a very fun discography, and I'm very excited to be covering them for today's video. So what I'm going to do is go through their 5 studio albums from Doppelganger up to The New Adventures of Curve, and I will also be including their compilation album Pubic Fruit, which is their first 3 EPs combined into one album. And normally on these videos I try to stick to just studio albums, but I know Pubic Fruit is so popular amongst the Curve fan base, and I didn't want to disappoint anyone by leaving it out, so I decided to include it as well. So I'm going to go through each of these albums and score them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments as well. I would love to hear where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 6 albums. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Alright, we will start out with their debut studio album from 1992 titled Doppelganger, and this one will get an easy S, no big surprises. Absolutely amazing first album. They had released 3 EPs prior to this, but I think for anyone first hearing their sound, it's very engaging and it brings the listener right in, and stylistically it's like this great love child of dance, electronic, dream pop, alternative, and shoegaze. So from a writing perspective, we're getting so many different worlds combined into one, and the writing process for them was fascinating. Nothing was ever pre-planned. Tony and Dean would just get together and Dean would come up with some music and Tony would write over it and see where it goes, with the goal always being to write stuff that sounds different and pushes things into new and unheard territories. We have Alan Moulder contributing guitars to this one, and I would say in general, I think a lot of the reason why people categorize Curve as a shoegaze band is because of the guitar sounds. Whenever their songs incorporate guitars, I feel like those are always the songs that have the most shoegaze elements to them. From an electronic standpoint, we have all sorts of different beats being sampled, ranging from Led Zeppelin to Public Enemy. We've got 10 tracks on here that showcase Curve's incredibly unique sound and writing style, with the amazing drum samples, the use of electronics, the dance and dream pop elements, as well as lots of washy guitars and reverb-laden shoegaze production. So a very hard band to categorize into one genre, and that's part of what makes their sound so fascinating. It opens up beautifully with Already Yours, a nice up-tempo song that brings us in with a great energy. It's got beautiful vocal melodies, and the distorted guitars add some really nice additional layers to the very full sound. I also love the turn that the chorus takes into some very colorful and pretty territories that contrast the verse very nicely, and that's a technique that I think Curve does very effectively in their writing, having 2 sections that contrast each other really nicely and surprise you when they switch up, and you're going to hear me point that out in numerous different songs throughout this video. After that, we have track 2 titled Horror Head, which is my all-time favorite Curve song, hands down. In my opinion, everything about this song is perfect, between the very beautiful vocal parts, the super groovy bass line, the washy guitars, and just the general euphoric mood of this song. I love how it opens up with just the vocal part, and then when the full band enters, it just hits so hard and feels so good. Just the ultimate song to put you in an awesome vibe, and this is a song that I could listen to over and over and over again and never get tired of it. And for me, this was the song that got me hooked on Curve and made me want to explore all of their discography. Then we continue with Wish You Dead, another up-tempo driving track with great vocal work and a particularly catchy chorus, in my opinion. After that, we have my second favorite song on here, which is the title track, Doppelganger, another song that starts out on a more feel-good vibe, but then takes some very dark and ominous turns that I love so much. Tony's vocal work could not be better over these grooves. Really the perfect fusion of instrumentation and vocal timbre. Then we have Lily's Dying, another song with very catchy vocal melodies and a rock-solid groove. And up to this point, this album has just been on fire, in my opinion. We're halfway through, and I think every song has just been incredible. Then we continue with track 6, titled Ice That Melts the Tips. Another more feel-good dream pop sort of track in the Mixolydian mode with some beautiful vocal harmonies and catchy melodies. And I think this song was placed in a great spot and contrasts the general mood of the opening 5 tracks very nicely. And then we have Split into Fractions, a cool song. And to me, something that has always made this track is the guitar parts that come in at the end of each set of vocal phrases. Little subtle things like that make such a difference within these songs. Nice groovy bass line and nice punchy bass sound as well, and a great drum sample. When it switches to the second section, I really love the first bass note that comes in as well. I always found it very unexpected and it always caught my ear, and I just love musical moments like that. Then we have Think and Act, which mixes up the style nicely and brings us into more of a dream pop territory. One of my favorite tracks from the second half of the album, and a song that I think was placed at the perfect spot in the track listing. Amazing vocal work from Tony as well. Then that is followed by the first single from this album, Fait Accompli, another amazing song with a very groovy and feel-good vibe. Really nice synth sounds, catchy vocal melodies, and a nice little heavier chord change getting introduced in the second half of the main section, and it sets up the final track beautifully, which is Sandpit. And this is a very unique song. One thing that Curve has a tendency of doing is concluding their albums on tracks that veer off into different stylistic territories, and this is definitely one example of that. It's a very spacey and vibey track that doesn't have any drums, and it's stripped down, but it also has all sorts of tasteful and euphoric layers around it. The distorted guitars in particular add so much depth to the track, and I absolutely love Tony's vocal phrasing throughout this. This track would definitely be another favorite of mine on here, and it is the perfect conclusion to a very engaging and adventurous album. So like I said before, Horrorhead is my all-time favorite Curve song, but a couple of other favorites on here for me would be Doppelganger, Already Yours, Sandpit, and Lily's Dying. So an amazing debut album with just incredible depth and beauty, and some of my all-time favorite songs from Curve's discography. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have a compilation album from 1992 titled Pubic Fruit, and I will also give this one an S. Another amazing release. Track-wise, this consists of their first 3 EPs, which all predate Doppelganger, and we get 4 tracks from each EP, as well as an extended version of Fait Accompli, so 12 new songs and 1 alternate version of an already released song. And I think this is a really great batch of tracks, and is a very easy listen from front to back, but is also incredibly engaging and contains all of those elements that make Curve's sound so unique and original. And for someone who is a first-time listener of Curve and is discovering them through these EPs or through this compilation album, I think this is a great way to bring the listener into their sound. It starts out with the 4 tracks from the Blindfold EP with 10 Little Girls, I Speak Your Every Word, Blindfold, and No Escape from Heaven. 10 Little Girls opens things up beautifully. The track has a great energy and intensity to it, and I love the sparse use of guitar throughout. I Speak Your Every Word contrasts it very nicely with more of a mid-tempo track that has a feel-good first section and then veers into different territories for the second section with darker chord movements and really euphoric vocal harmonies. And this is my personal favorite track from their first EP. And then we have Blindfold, which would be my second favorite track from the first EP. I just love the vibe of this one so much. So many amazing lush and magical sounds all wrapped in one. I love Tony's spoken word stuff inserted sparsely throughout the tracks. And then we have No Escape from Heaven, a very cool song in more of that feel-good dream pop sort of realm, and a great way to wrap up the first EP. And I think all 4 of these tracks contrast each other wonderfully, but still fit together very nicely and demonstrate Curve's incredibly unique and dynamic writing ability. After that, we get to the second EP titled Frozen, which is my personal favorite of the 3. This whole EP is just such a vibe, and in my opinion contains the highest points of this album. The 4 tracks we have on here are Coast is Clear, The Color Hurts, Frozen, and Zoo. Coast is Clear is definitely one of my favorites from this album. It has such a great beat and bass line. It grooves so hard, and the layers upon layers of sounds all over it create such a dreamy and ambient atmosphere. The Color Hurts brings the tempo down a bit, similar to track 2 from the first EP, a great placement and another rock-solid song from this album. Then we have Frozen, which is my favorite track from the second EP, another feel-good dream pop sort of vibe with such beautiful vocal work from Tony, and a song like this to me is just the perfect combination of groove and beauty. Then we have Zoo, another very cool song with interesting electronic drum parts, with distorted guitars and all sorts of synth parts layered on top of each other. So many little subtle things going on that add so much richness to all of these songs, and a great closing track to the second EP. Then we have the 4 tracks from the third EP, Cherry, with Clipped, Die Like a Dog, Galaxy, and the title track, Cherry. Clipped starts us out with another up-tempo, driving, feel-good track, and another one where the second section veers into a little bit of a darker territory. I really love the way the song ends with the drums dropping out. I thought that was a very cool choice. And then we have Die Like a Dog, which is a great vibey song. I love the bass line and the electronic parts, as well as the back and forth between the instrumental and vocal parts. Very tasteful vocal melody too, and I like how it's mixed where it's just loud enough to hear, but also slightly obscured within the music, so it's hard to make out the lyrics, which is a staple of shoegaze production. Then we have another vibey song titled Galaxy, which is a song with great drive to it and hard-hitting grooves. And then we have the title track, Cherry, a super cool song with very dreamy elements to it. I love the synth sounds, and Tony's vocal phrasing and timbre really add to that spacey and dreamlike vibe of the track. And it builds really beautifully, and when the full instrumentation enters, it just feels so epic and satisfying, and you just get lost in this wash of sound. Great use of dynamics throughout, and definitely my favorite closing track of the 3 EPs. And then that is followed by the extended version of Fait Accompli, which is a very nice addition to this compilation album and wraps everything up very nicely with a Curve classic. So as you could see, I don't have a bad thing to say about any of these tracks. I think each EP is very interesting, and they each contain their own unique elements and include tracks that demonstrate their continual development and evolution of their sound in this early part of their discography. My favorites on here would have to be 10 Little Girls, I Speak Your Every Word, Coast is Clear, Frozen, and Cherry. So a little bit from every EP, which is awesome. And in my opinion, this is one of the best compilation albums ever released. So this one gets an easy S. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1993 titled Cuckoo, and this one will also get an S. Incredible album, and in my opinion, the perfect follow-up to Doppelganger. I always have had a hard time choosing which one I like better between those two albums because they both have their own unique elements that I love so much, but my general feeling about the two albums is that I think this one is a little bit more enjoyable as a full album listen. I think there is more adventure within these tracks, and they're trying out a lot more stuff than they had done on Doppelganger, but I would say that Doppelganger contains more of my favorite Curve songs. So if we're talking exceptional standout tracks, I would go with Doppelganger, but if we're talking just, a full album listen, I would probably go with Cuckoo. And I know that Tony and Dean did like this album more than Doppelganger, and they had felt like this one was more concise and fleshed out, and they had also said that on Doppelganger they had focused more on the production side of things, whereas with this one they focused more on the songs. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you compare those two albums back to back. This one starts out amazingly with Missing Link, bringing us in on a heavy, hard-hitting groove with distorted guitars. I love how the guitars drop out for the opening vocal parts, and then when Tony's harmonies come in, the distorted guitars enter back in. Again, a really nice little subtle change in the instrumentation that just makes a world of difference. The chorus on this one is very tasteful too, really pretty vocal melody against the chord progression. And then that is followed up by Crystal, another solid track with an interesting change in mood between the two sections, opening up with a more ambient, euphoric, electronic section, and then when the chorus enters, it takes such a cool, eerie turn that has always caught my ear and surprised me to this day when I hear it. This song also has a very beautiful bridge as well, which I love. Then we continue with Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, another nice chill and dreamy track with all sorts of beautiful layers of electronics and distorted guitars. And then that is followed by All of One, and I've always felt like this song is placed perfectly in the track listing. It's a little more upbeat and poppy, and it does a really great job of contrasting the opening three songs, which I would say are all more in the darker territory. And in general, I would say that this album is a little bit darker than Doppelganger as well, which is something that I always enjoy. I love the way the guitars are utilized throughout this too. You have the stripped down electronic section, and then the washy guitars enter, and it adds such a nice layer of richness to the song. After that, we have Unreadable Communication, a very cool song that builds up beautifully, really nice use of delay in the drums as well as panning with the cymbals, and a very nice change in the chorus with the distorted guitar and distorted vocals. Super intense and very dynamic track. Then we have Turkey Crossing, which is another darker, more eerie track. I find the guitars to be particularly ominous on this one. Whenever they come in, they just add another dark layer to the sound, and Tony's vocals just flow beautifully over this amazing mood that is being set. Then that is followed by Super Blaster, which was one of the singles from this album, and it's another nice change in mood from the darker previous couple of tracks. This one gives us more of an upbeat dream pop vibe. Instrumentally, this one gives me a Cocteau Twins Heaven or Las Vegas vibe, which obviously is a great thing. Amazing guitar tones too, just perfectly fitting, and the vocal harmonies are also very tasteful. And then we take a surprising turn with Left of Mother, which opens up with acoustic guitar and violin, something very different from what we've heard from a Curve song thus far, and eventually it works its way into the electronic drums. Very cool from an instrumentation standpoint, combining acoustic guitar, violin, and electronics, just in a very tasteful manner. Then we go into Sweetest Pie, which is a beautiful, mysterious, and dreamy track using real drums and a nice spot on the album to mix it up with a drum kit track. The vocals on this one are so tasteful against the chord progression, and I love the instrumental section that happens halfway through the song. Then the album concludes with the title track, Cuckoo, which is such a pretty and dreamy song to end the album on. This one has always reminded me of Julie Cruz with the very spacey vibe and the softer vocal articulations with that more breathy sort of attack. And believe it or not, this is probably my favorite song from this album. I find myself coming back to this one more than anything else from this album, and I think it's just the perfect closer. And as we went through track by track, I think it's pretty clear that their sound had expanded into more and more territories on this album and provided a lot of new things for us from a stylistic, instrumentation, and production standpoint, and gave us a very strong follow-up to Doppelganger. And like I said, I think this one is more engaging as a full album, but Doppelganger contains more of my favorite Curve songs, so I've always been conflicted as to which one I like better, but I really do think I might just need to call it a tie because they're both just so good in their own different ways. So another amazing album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their third studio album from 1998 titled Come Clean, and I will give this one a B. I think this is a fairly good album. There is a nice chunk of it that I really enjoy, but I think my main issue is that I think it's a little too long and has a couple too many tracks that I think could have been left off of the album, and it would have enhanced it a lot. We definitely have a bit of a stylistic shift, and that is something that we see happen with a lot of bands that had more of a shoegazy sort of sound in the early 90s. That was sort of the peak of that musical movement, and a lot of those bands started to veer off into different territories stylistically in the later part of the 90s, and this album is definitely another example of that. But at the same time, like I said at the beginning of the video, Curve has always utilized more electronics than a traditional shoegaze band would, so their evolution in sound, I think, sounded more natural, and it didn't sound like a complete 180 from their earlier works. There's a 4.5-year gap from the previous album, and after the release of Cuckoo, Curve had actually broken up. but then they had reunited in 1996 and announced that they were going to be releasing a third album, which culminated into this. Stylistically, this one is much more in that electronic rock, techno, and dance sort of realm, with very little of those shoegaze flavors that we had gotten from the 3 previous releases. But I still think that the quality of songs throughout this album is relatively strong, and it still does contain a lot of those core elements of the Curve sound that we did get from the first 3 albums. And I'm hearing influences from other areas as well, getting tastes of so many different things, ranging from Portishead to Underworld and Aphex Twin. And I do think there are a couple of songs on here that sound relatively similar to one another. And like I said, I think trimming it down a bit could have enhanced the album. But regardless of that, I think this album does deliver and does have a handful of really awesome electronic rock songs with tasteful vocal melodies, solid grooves, a nice contrast in mood and tempo from track to track, as well as a very adventurous and unique mix of electronics, synths, and drum programming. I think the opening 2 tracks are very strong, with Chinese Burn and Coming Up Roses, definitely one of the high points of the album for me. Track 3, Something Familiar, has a nice vibe to it, and I love the way the energy picks up for the chorus with the distorted guitars. Then we have one of a few songs on here that I don't care about, starting out with Dogbone. Not a very exciting song in my opinion, but after that we have my favorite song on here with Alligators Getting Up. I get some serious Portishead vibes from this one, and I love it so much. I'm not too crazy about the track that follows it though, with Dirty High, another skip over one for me. And then Killer Baby, I would say, is a pretty cool track. I like the synth and bass sounds used throughout it, and another one with a nice energetic chorus. Then we have Sweetback, which for me is one of those songs where I only really like one section of it. When the drums come in for that energetic part, I think that's cool, but in between that, I find the rest of the song kind of boring. Forgotten Sanity is a pretty good song, not a favorite of mine on here, but I do think it has a cool vibe and an interesting bass line. Cotton Candy is a very cool and vibey song. I love the vocal melody over the second section, really tasteful note choice and beautiful harmonies. And then after that, we have Beyond Reach, which is another track that doesn't really do anything for me. I do think that the ending 2 tracks are really solid, though. I think the album closes very nicely. The title track, Come Clean, has a super cool and different vibe to it. It almost reminds me of Sonic Youth. I would say it's one of the more different sounding Curve tracks up to this point, but I think in a very cool way. And then the closing track, Recovery, gives us one of those dark and hard-hitting Curve tracks that wraps up the album on a very satisfying note. So I don't think this is a bad album. I think it sounds very fitting for the times, with the influence of electronics and dance music becoming more and more prevalent in the late 90s. And I think they did a great job of combining those elements with some of the core elements to their sound to create a really enjoyable electronic album. It does have a handful of tracks that I don't care for, and like I said, I think if it was trimmed down to like 9 or 10 songs, it would have been a lot better. But I think the opening 2 tracks are good, the closing 2 tracks are good, and then Alligators Getting Up is by far my favorite. I think the high point from this album. But in general, I would say it's an okay album with a couple of tracks that I love, but a handful of tracks that I find kind of underwhelming, so this one is going to get a B. All right, next we have their 4th studio album from 2001 titled Gift, and I will also give this one a B. This was a tough scoring for me because there is a big chunk of this album that I really love, but there are a couple of things that I'm not crazy about, and ultimately it seemed more fair to put it in B tier rather than A. I do think it is an upgrade from Come Clean though, I will say that. And it's also worth noting that this is the album that Kevin Shields from My Bloody Valentine contributed guitar to. I love the way it opens up on the hard-hitting track Hell Above Water, a very dark and eerie song with nice heavy and distorted guitars. Just an awesome way to bring things in for this album, and definitely a different vibe from the opening track of the previous release. And for me, this is definitely one of the high points of the album. Then we go into the title track, Gift, which keeps the energy up and continues on more of that eerie vibe, but also has a brighter chorus, which balances it out very nicely. Then we go into Want More, Need Less, which is a nice change in vibe from the opening two tracks, giving us something that starts out in a major key and then veers into some very pretty territories for the chorus. The production and guitar parts on this one I think were done very nicely. Beautiful vocal harmonies as well. Then we have by far my favorite song from this album, Perish. Such a beautiful and dreamy song, great synth sounds, great mixing of guitars and synthesizers, and some very beautiful vocal work. To me, this is a track that sounds like it could have been on one of their earlier albums, which is probably why I love it so much. So up to this point, I think the first chunk of this album has been great. After that, the tempo comes down a bit with Hung Up, and this is another chiller track that has some more of those moody, dark, and eerie vibes to it. I enjoy this song, and I think it is a nice follow-up to Perish, but with that being said, I do think it goes on for a tad long, and it could have been trimmed down a bit. But up to this point, we're halfway through the album, and I've only had one critique so far. But after that, we have my least favorite track on here, titled Chainmail. This one just doesn't do anything for me in comparison to everything else that we've heard so far, and I think this is probably the least standout track from this album. And I'm not super crazy about the song that follows it either, with Fly With the High. I think the chorus isn't bad, but other than that, I wouldn't say this is a really exciting or exceptional track from this album. After that, we have a track called My Tiled White Floor, and to me, this song is the highlight of the second half of the album. I particularly enjoy the chorus, and I really love the contrast and energy between the two main sections. After that, we have one other track that I'm not super crazy about with Polaroid. It's another one of those songs where I think the chorus is nice, but other than that, it doesn't really do anything for me. And as you can see, the majority of my issues with this album happen between tracks 6 and 9, because I thought the first 5 tracks were great, and then it takes a few dips from tracks 6 to 9 for me, but I do really enjoy the closing track, Bleeding Heart. I really like the sampled drum groove. It sets up a really cool ambient vibe, and Tony's vocal melodies just tie everything together so beautifully. And this is the other track that I would say is the highlight of the second half of the album, and I really love the groove change at the end of the song. It's a very nice surprise that ends the album with a really nice jolt of energy. So I have very conflicting thoughts about this album because there are about 6 to 7 songs on here that I really enjoy, and stylistically I do think that this is a very adventurous album from track to track, and it goes in a lot of interesting territories. But there are those 3 songs that I'm not crazy about, and I do think they do take away from the momentum of the album a little bit, and liking 7 out of 10 songs, that comes out to 70%. So because of that, it just didn't feel right putting it in A tier. But regardless of that, like I said, I do still think it is an upgrade from Come Clean, and it has more standout tracks in my opinion. So not one of their best, but not one of their worst. I will give this one a B. Alright, now we have their 5th and final studio album from 2002 titled The New Adventures of Curve, and I'm going to give this one an A. This is a very good album. I have a couple of minor issues with it, and I don't think it is perfect, but I do think that about 85% of this album is absolutely incredible. Right from the opening track, it has my complete attention with Answers. I think this is one of their best opening tracks of any album. It brings the listener right in with this techno vibe that has these dark and mysterious grooves going on. As far as the album goes, this would be my 3rd favorite song from this album, and probably other than Doppelganger, this might be my favorite opening track of any Curve album, believe it or not. And then that is followed up by Till the Cows Come Home. This has always been a song that I've had a hard time getting into. I know some people love it, and I've tried to get into it, but I just find it kind of boring. And this is one of 2 songs on this album that I'm not crazy about, which is ultimately why I put it in A tier. After that, we have Every Good Girl, which is a track I really enjoy. A nice mysterious and low-key sort of vibe for the verse, and then a very awesome chorus that has great intensity to it and contrasts the verse very nicely. Beautiful and dreamy synth sounds, and a hard-hitting bass line as well. Then we have Cold Comfort, which brings the energy up very nicely and has a nice party vibe to it. I almost hear some Aphex Twin influences going on this one, and I really love what they're doing with the electronics all throughout this album so far. Then we continue with Star, which is a very cool song with really interesting vibe switches going on between the minimalism of the verse going into the more noisy and layered pre-chorus and chorus. I think the pre-chorus and chorus on this one are particularly pretty. Again, almost giving me a Cocktail Mistletoe Twins sort of vibe. Then it goes into Nice and Easy, which is one of the other songs on here that I've never been super crazy about. I just find it kind of boring in comparison to all of the other standout tracks that have already happened. But then from this point on, I absolutely love all three of the remaining tracks of this album. I think the end of this album is actually the high point, and believe it or not, this might be one of my favorite sequences of 3 tracks from any Curve album, starting out with Signals and Alibis, which is my favorite track on this album by far. Very pretty, chill, and dreamy track with amazing synth sounds, great drum sounds, and a beautiful and euphoric vocal melody. The chorus of this song is probably my favorite musical section of this entire album. Just such beautiful stuff, and a song that does a great job of really stretching out and taking its time, but providing such a great vibe that just flows right by and doesn't feel like a really long song. After that, we have Sinner, which would be my second favorite track on here, a beautifully intense song with some really sad undertones to it, and another one with such a powerful chorus that just hits you and pulls at your heartstrings with those vocal melodies. What an incredible succession of 2 songs. And then we have another amazing track with the closer titled Joy, which definitely changes up the vibe from the previous 2 songs, which were very dreamy, lush, and euphoric. This one takes on a more up-tempo driving sort of energy, and actually features Dean on vocals, which also contrasts the rest of the album and Curve's music in general a lot. And I actually really enjoy this track. It's got some really interesting sounds all throughout it, and to me it has little tastes of different bands like Radiohead and Sonic Youth, and it definitely makes me wonder that if this hadn't been Curve's last album and they had continued writing, I wonder what other sort of territories they would have entered into, because I think this song is probably the most different stylistically from everything else that we've heard from them, and it's a shame that we wouldn't get to see how that sound would continue to evolve, because I really love what they did on this. And while this album does have 2 tracks that I could have done without, I think the quality of the other 7 songs is just so strong, and this album also includes 3 tracks that would make my top 10 favorite Curve song list, with Signals and Alibis, Sinner, and Answers. And I do think the quality of the songwriting on here is better than it had been on the previous 2 albums, and the way that they utilized different loops, synthesizers, and electronics was very tasteful and really just keeps the listener on the edge of their seat, wondering what was going to come next. So I am very happy with this being the last album that they left off on. It's got some really amazing songs, and concluding with that final track that has Dean on vocals was a very interesting way to leave things off, for all of the reasons that I had already explained before. So a very good album to go out on. This one will get an A. All right, we did it. We went through their 5 studio albums and the first compilation album, and this is what I ended up with. It was a really enjoyable experience to go through their entire discography, and for anyone listening who hasn't checked out all of their albums, I would highly recommend it, and I think there will be plenty of things that you enjoy from each of them. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable, and if you are interested, feel free to check out my other tier lists linked in the comments and the descriptions, and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 6 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that is it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.